Make an umbrella tote with Lindsey.
Hello Kiki readers, my name is Lindsey and today I'm going to be your guide for how to make a tote bag from a broken umbrella. So this bag might be a little bit of a challenge if you're new at sewing, so try not to be too hard on yourself if you make some mistakes. Even really experienced seamstresses and people who have been sewing for a long time become best friends with their seam ripper. So mistakes can actually really be part of the learning process. So just take it one step at a time and try your best, and if it doesn't turn out just like this video, that's okay too. Just be open to that. Okay, just really quick, I wanted to show you around the sewing machine a little bit so that you know what I'm doing or what I'm talking about while I'm sewing. So this button here is my back tack, and when I say back tack, I mean when you start to sew, you start to sew forward and then you quickly sew back really fast. So and that just secures the end of the stitch when you're sewing. So when I say back tack, that's what I'm doing. This right here is my stitch length. And if you're sewing two seams together, something that you want to have strength, something that you're not planning on ripping back out, you're going to have a smaller stitch size. So I'm going to do mine in between 2 and 3, but a little bit closer to the 2. We're going to talk about basting stitches later, and that would be closer to a 4. Over here is the different kind of stitches I can do. I have buttonhole stitches and zigzag stitches, and we're just going to do a regular stitch. Here's my thread, and depending on what kind of sewing machine you have, you may need to ask for help for threading. And then of course down here is where the bobbin is. You can see right there. So, and again, if you don't know how to thread the bobbin in your machine, maybe you can ask whoever owns the machine how to help you with that. Okay, I'm just going to go over some of the tools that we're going to use during this video. So of course we have our sewing machine and our thread, and you can use the same color thread as your fabric, or if you want to use a brighter color thread as a detail, you can do that too. But just remember that if you use a contrasting thread, that your mistakes show stronger than if you used the same color thread. But some people really like that bold detail, so whichever thread you want. We're going to use a hand sewing needle, if you can see that there. We're going to use a seam ripper and a pencil, a ruler. An 18-inch ruler would be better if you have it. We're going to, of course, use our pins, and then fabric scissors, and if you also have paper scissors, that would be good too. And then for this video, we're going to use some tape, any kind of tape, but masking tape might be better, and rope. And we're not using the rope for any kind of sewing details, just for an exercise. So any kind of rope or ribbon that you have that you don't need, that you're not worried about. Okay, let's get started. Step 1. Free your fabric. The first thing that we're going to do is separate the fabric from the skeleton of the umbrella so that we just have the fabric. And I don't know if you can see here, if you look close, that all of these arms are connected with little stitches. Do you see that? So instead of using a scissors today, because I might accidentally slip and cut the fabric, I'm just going to use a seam ripper so that I can get under the stitch and just rip the stitch and not the fabric. But just be careful, because even though it's a small little tool, it actually is quite sharp, and I've accidentally stabbed my hand when I'm ripping out stitches, so try not to rip your fabric or your fingers. Okay, now that I have separated all the stitches from the skeleton, you're going to have to get the top off here, and if you're lucky, it'll just unscrew and you can separate it, but you may need to ask for help. You may need to use some tools to pry it off there. But make sure whatever fabric is on your umbrella that you save that. We might be able to use it later. So even these tiny little pieces of fabric, save those too. Okay, now that you have your fabric separated, go ahead and take it over and iron it. And that's probably a good idea anytime you're starting a project, and actually in between each step. It's just to always iron, because things will lay better and cut better and sew better. And it's also a good idea when you're buying fabric to kind of have a good idea of what kind of fabric you're buying. Is it a natural fabric or a man-made fabric? Because actually on the iron, there are different settings for different fabrics. So cottons and natural fibers actually tend to have a higher heat setting than the man-made fibers. The man-made fibers have a more tendency to melt with your iron, so it's a lower setting. And actually when you're ironing some man-made fibers, sometimes it's good to put a piece of fabric like cotton or a pillowcase or something on top of it and then iron it so that you don't melt it. In this case, it's probably okay on the ironing board to iron it, but make sure it's on a synthetic setting.
Step 2, fold and cut.
Okay, here, do your best to fold your umbrella fabric in half. It's probably not going to fold perfectly in half, so just match the corners to the best that you can. So here's the fold right here, and here's the open edges of the umbrella fabric. Right here is the hole where I pulled it off the top of the umbrella. So what I want you to look for is when the pieces of the umbrella make the shape of a V here. Do you see that? So if the hole's here, and then there's the shape of a V. And you can choose whether or not you want this in your tote bag. I'm going to leave it on because you can actually roll up your purse and throw it in your bag for if you need like an extra bag or something somewhere. So whether or not you want this, that's up to you. But while you have it folded like this, you want to go ahead and put some pins in it so when you're cutting it, it will stay together and it won't turn or you won't get a bad cut. Okay, so this is where we're going to use our ruler and our pencil. Where you have the shape of the V, I want you to go to the corner, the top of the V, and try to make a straight line. So maybe use the edge of your ruler against the fold as a guide. So if you can draw a straight line from the bottom where the fold is to the corner of that V, and just a light line, it doesn't have to be a dark line. And you're going to do that on both sides. Okay, now make sure, like I said, that everything's pinned together, and do your best to line things up. So make sure these corners are lined up so that when you cut it out, it's the same on both sides. So I'm just going to cut down that line. Make sure you cut through to both sides, the folded sides. And you want to try and cut as straight of a line as possible. So you'll see now that I took the pins out that it's going to look like a big rectangle, and instead of a V, it's going to look like a big X. And this is where that hole was that I took the center out of the umbrella. Now you're going to have to make a paper pattern for your straps. And first you're going to have to decide how wide and how long you want your straps to be. I chose to make mine 1.25 inches. And so what I did is I multiplied that by 2 because we're going to fold it in half. And then I added a 1/2 inch for seam allowance, so that made it 3 inches wide. And then this is going to depend on how much fabric you have left, but I made my paper pattern 20 inches long. So mine is 3 inches by 20 inches. And if you want to go ahead and do that, that might be easier too. So now you're going to want to, your leftover pieces of fabric from when you cut out the rectangle, you're going to want to lay those on top of each other, okay? Like this. And then we're going to pin the paper pattern to the 2 pieces. And anytime you're pinning a pattern piece to fabric, you want to try and save as much extra fabric as possible because you never know when you'll need extra details or an extra piece of fabric. So I did my best to put it close to the edge so that I wasn't wasting fabric. When you're done pinning, you can go ahead and cut that out. And like I said, cut as close to the edge as possible and do your best to cut a straight line. That'll help you in the end because if your cutting is straight, then when you use that as a guide, your stitching lines will also be straight. Now that we have our strap cut out, we still have a few pieces of fabric left over, and that's good. You always want to save all scraps until you're done. You never know when you can use those. We're going to cut out a patch for the hole in the fabric, and this can be a square or a circle. I'm going to do a circle because I like the look of it, but keep in mind that sewing a circle is actually pretty difficult, so it might be easier if you just do a square. And then I'm also going to use this to make a pocket. And again, if a pocket sounds like too much, don't worry about that. It's just an extra detail. Anytime that I'm using fabric that's been used before, so like a piece of clothing or in this case an umbrella, I try to use any of the sewn details that are already part of the fabric because it makes our job easier, but it also sometimes has a cool look to it. So for this, if you can see the edge there is already hemmed. So I'm going to use that as the top of my pocket. So that way I don't have to hem the pocket. So you could do a square and use that as your top, or in my case, I'm going to use the pointed top so that it almost looks like a house when I cut it out. I'm just going to eyeball the patch and the pocket, but if you would rather make those shapes out of paper first and pin them down and cut them out just like we did the straps, that's good too. So I'm cutting a circle here for the hole, and then I'm going to cut 2 straight lines to make the pocket. So here's my circle patch. Okay, and I'm also just going to trim up the bottom so it looks a little nicer. So I want this to be a flat bottom. Okay, so this is what my pocket piece looks like, and this is going to be the top of the pocket, and then this is going to be the bottom.
Step 3. Sew your straps.
So we're going to go back to the straps. Go ahead and unpin the paper pattern from the two pieces of fabric, and then you're going to fold the fabric in half inside out long ways. Okay, and you're going to put the pins on the edge here so that they're sticking out, and you want to try and make them as straight and perpendicular as possible because we're actually going to sew over those pins, and if they're not straight they can get caught in the machine or you can break a needle. And you're just going to do that all the way down. So this is what it's going to look like when it's all pinned up. And actually, if it feels like your fabric is pretty slippery, you might just want to put in extra pins. It'll hold the fabric together. So the more slippery your fabric, the more pins you should use. This is where that piece of rope is going to come into play. So now that I have my pinned tube of fabric, I'm actually just going to stick the rope in down the folded side all the way through. And if it's easier for you, you can fold the rope in before you pin it up. Sometimes I find it's hard to keep the rope in place, so that's why I do it later. Okay, so it's going to be all the way through to both sides. And you're just going to leave one side exposed, or open at the top here. So we're going to do two things when we go to sew it. We're going to sew a straight line down over the pins, and we're going to sew a basting stitch on top of this. And a basting stitch just means it's a really big stitch and it's meant for ripping it back out. So when you baste something, you're just holding it in place really quickly and then you're going to rip it out. So it's not used to hold anything together. So for this stitch here, you're going to do your stitch length between 2 and 3, and then for this stitch you're probably going to use the biggest stitch that you have. If you haven't used your machine in a long time, or maybe you've never used it before, this is another way that you can use those fabric scraps that you have left over. So you can actually just get a piece and you can test your stitch length this way also. So for example, this is what the size I would use for putting a seam together. Okay, so see, that's kind of a smaller stitch. So then this would be what your basting stitch looks like. Okay, so see, the basting stitch is much bigger than the other stitch, and it's so that you can easily rip it out. So maybe before you start sewing, just take a second and play around on some scraps so that you can see how the machine sews and what the different stitches look like, and then you can sew your straps. Do you remember when we were making our strap patterns and I told you to add a 1/2 inch for seam allowance? So remember, we're folding this in half. So if we added a 1/2 inch total, that means we added 1/4 of an inch on each side. So our seams are actually going to be 1/4 of an inch. And your sewing machine actually might already be marked, but if it's not, something that can help you sew a straight line is you can go ahead and measure from the needle 1/4 of an inch out. And then you can mark that with a piece of tape. Okay? So just any kind of tape, masking tape is probably fine. Can you see that there? So I want to sew, I'm going to put my edge of the fabric against this edge of the tape, and it'll make it much easier to sew a straight line. So see, I'll line it up right here. Okay, so when you're pushing it through very slowly, just make sure that the edge of the fabric is running alongside your tape. So I'm going to go ahead and push the needle through the fabric. Now, do you remember when I talked about back tacking? Because we're going to sew a little bit forward, and now we're going to go a little bit back. Okay? So now just very slowly let the fabric go through the machine alongside your tape. So your hand is really just a guide for the fabric. You're not going to push the fabric through at all. The fabric just kind of gets sucked through the machine, and you just let it go in its natural way. So we're going to get to the end here, and I'm going to back tack again. Now going back to my rope, I'm going to change my length of my stitch, and I'm just going to stitch over the rope. And I didn't even back tack for that because I'm going to rip it back out. Now that you have your strap sewn on the side and with the rope, you're going to go ahead and take all your pins out. And this is where the rope comes in handy. Is we sewed this inside out, so now we need to flip it so that it's right side out. So what I do is I just hold the edge of the rope and I just pull it so that it gets to the bottom here. And you can actually just keep pulling it, and it should totally flip inside out. And you don't have to do it this way. If you'd just rather sew it and flip it out on your own, that's fine too, but I find that this is a really quick trick for flipping skinny things inside out. So go ahead and sew your other strap the same way, and then go ahead and flip it out also. Now that you have your strap sewn, you can go ahead and rip the basting stitches from the rope. So we're going to go ahead and just pull the rope out. Okay, so see? Okay, so now that you have your rope out of your straps, we're going to go ahead and iron them. And remember, every time you sew, whatever step you're doing, it's always good to go ahead and press what you've sewn. It just makes everything fit together better. My mom, when I was a kid sewing with her, she would always say, sew, clip, press, like a motto. So you'd sew, and then you clip your threads, and then you press your seams or your top stitching. And so I actually threw a couple of pins in just so that I could fold it as far over as I could. I'm not going to iron over the pins. I just wanted to kind of hold it in place, and I'll pull the pins out as I iron. Now that you have your straps pressed, I'm going to do a top stitching detail on my straps. I think that it gives the straps more strength since you're going to be carrying it and they carry weight. And I think also it looks pretty cool when it's done. You can skip this step if you don't feel comfortable with it, but I highly recommend it if you want to go ahead and challenge yourself. So what I'm doing is I'm pinning both sides just a little bit. You don't have to pin a lot, just enough to kind of hold it in place. For this top stitching, I'm going to sew a line that's 1/4 of an inch away from the needle, just like we did before, so you can use your tape as a guide again. So I'm going to line it up, and remember, I'm going to back stitch once I start stitching. And again, just do this real slow so that you can try and sew a straight line, because don't pressure yourself to sew fast. You might be able to sew more accurately if you sew slow. Okay, so that's how that first one turned out there. Okay. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like when you have it all together. Okay. And if you have a mistake, like I made it got stuck right here, I'm just going to go ahead and use my seam ripper to rip that spot out, and I'll just sew a straight line on top of it. And so sometimes that happens, and like I said, just be open to the mistakes and learning from them. Step 4. Pin and sew your pieces on. Here we're going back to the rectangle that we cut out earlier, and now we're going to pin on the pocket and the patch that's used to cover up the hole. So you're going to pin out from the fabric. I know when you cut it you pin alongside with the fabric, but we're going to pin out because we're going to actually sew over these pins like we did before. Now I put the pocket on the opposite side of this piece, because I wanted this to be in the back and this to be in the front. But you can pin your pocket wherever you like. I put it in the middle of the V. You can have your pocket off to the side or closer to the bottom, so wherever you want your pocket is fine. I'm not pinning the part that's hemmed. I'm only pinning the sides and the bottom. So this is what it'll look like up close. We're going to go ahead and sew the patch and the pocket on, and since the fabric is covering up where you marked your sewing machine with your tape, try to use the edge of your patch and your pocket as your guide. So you're going to line up the edge of your sewing foot to the edge of the patch and just try and keep that straight. And again, you might want to just go really slow so that you can get a crisp line with your sewing. And I'm going to back tack. So this is what it looks like when it's over, and we're going to have the edges exposed because most umbrella fabrics don't fray. The edges don't fray. In a lot of cases when you sew on patches or pockets, you're going to fold the edges under so that you have that crisp edge, and that way your edges don't fray and aren't exposed. Now we're going to move to the pocket. So I'm going to start right here. So here's my hemmed edge, and I'm going to start over here in the corner. And again, I'm going to use the edge of the pocket as my guide. I'm going to line the foot of my sewing machine there. And I'm going to back tack again. Now when you get close to the end of that line, I'm going to show you how to make a turn here, a corner. You're going to lift the foot up, but make sure the needle is still in the fabric. And you're going to turn it almost like a pivot, like in basketball. And then as soon as you have it where you want, you put the foot back down. Okay? And then I'm going to continue to sew a straight line. Okay, so that's what that's going to look like. Now you can go ahead and take all the pins out and trim up the leftover threads that are still hanging around. Now we're going to attach the straps to the bag. So first we have to decide where we want the straps to go. For when we sew the bag together, we're going to do a 1/2 inch seam instead of a 1/4 inch like we were doing. So go ahead and get your ruler back and measure in a 1/2 inch on each side, and just do a tiny little dot with your pencil, so just so you know where that is. Now you can have any measurement you like for where you want your straps. I'm going to go ahead and measure in 4 inches on each side from the 1/2 inch mark. Okay, and now I'm going to lay my strap next. I'm going to line the edge of my strap next to that 4 inch mark, and make sure your strap isn't twisted. Okay, and then you're going to want to fold your strap over about a 1/2 inch. You can measure it if you like, if that's easier. Okay. And now I'm also going to measure how far I put it down. I'm going to put it 2 inches down. So 4 inches over from the 1/2 inch seam and 2 inches down. I'm going to put some pins in there. You're going to want to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so that's what it looks like pinned on. Now, to give this strength, because if you have, say, a couple of books in your bag and you're holding your strap, you're going to want those straps to stay on really well. So I'm going to sew an X onto this strap to give it strength. And it might be easier if you just lightly pencil it on. It might be really hard to eyeball an X on your strap. So we're going to do a box with an X in it. And I'd say about 1 inch is a good size for your X. I'm going to use my top stitching as my guide for the sides of my box. So maybe you can see that X there. It's very light. And I'm probably going to end up pulling my pins out as I sew because it probably is going to get in the way of my X. So first I'm going to sew straight down on top of the top stitching I already did. It's a little bit harder for the machine to sew through a couple of layers of fabric, so you might have to be patient with it. So I'm going to go all the way down until I sew into the part that we folded under, because I want to make sure that part is secure. And now I'm going to do that thing where I lift up the foot and I make sure the needle's in the fabric and I turn the fabric. Okay, so now I'm going to sew straight across. Now when I get to the corner, I'm going to do the same thing where I make sure the needle is in there and I'm going to spin it, but instead of making my box, I'm actually going to do the first diagonal of my X. Okay, so now I got to the end of my diagonal, and now I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to draw the top of my box. So I'm going to do a straight line across. Okay, and now I'm going to do the X again. And you can do this whatever order you're comfortable with, but essentially you need to do a box and an X. And remember, when you're finished, you want to back tack. So now that you have an X, you want to go ahead and do that for all of your straps, all of the end of your straps. You're going to do 4 X's in a box total.
Step 5. Fold, sew, finish!
Alright, we are almost done. So what's left now that you have your straps and your patch and your pocket sewn on is we're going to fold our bag back in half, inside out. And we are going to pin the edges in a 1/2 inch, because that's what we're going to do. That's our seam allowance, is a 1/2 inch on the side. You can use a ruler if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and eyeball it. And you're going to do this on both sides. Make sure that you pin perpendicular to the fabric, as straight as possible. Okay, so this is what it should look like. It's folded in half and it's inside out. And then you have the pins sticking out on both sides. Now if your sewing machine's not marked, you might want to move your tape over. So put the needle down and measure over a 1/2 inch from your needle. And go ahead and mark it. So you're going to line up your fabric right next to that tape so that it'll be a 1/2 inch seam. Okay, needle down, and don't forget to back stitch. Do the same thing on the other side. Anytime that you're going to have a corner, go ahead and take your pins out. Anytime that you're going to have a corner, you're going to want to snip it just a little bit. So see here, this is going to be the corner of my bag. So I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut. So not into the stitch, but just right up really close to it. Yeah. so that when you flip it inside out, it'll be a much sharper corner. And trim the corner on the other side. Now you can go ahead and flip your bag inside out. You may have to pop those corners a little bit with your finger. If you still, even with your finger, if you still can't get it all the way, you could use maybe a dull pencil. So here we go. This would be a good opportunity to go ahead and get your iron out and press your seam. Make sure it's all the way right side out. The last thing that we're going to do is make a little bit of decoration and trim pieces to put on your bag for fun. And that's why I said to always save whatever scraps you have, because you can always find interesting things to do with those pieces. So these pieces I pulled off from the umbrella when I was taking it apart, and I'd like to use those. And then I'm also going to take one of the pieces and I'm just going to cut out a flower. So see my little flower? And I'm also going to take this piece that still has the hemmed edge right here, and I'm going to cut it really close to the edge, almost just 1/4 of an inch, so that I have almost like a piece of ribbon. Okay, so I have this little piece now. So now you need to get out your hand sewing needle, okay? And what I did is I laid this little piece, and then the bigger piece, and then the one that I cut out, all on top of each other. And I'm just going to put a couple of stitches with the hand needle in to hold it together. Okay, now I'm going to take this piece that I cut out and I'm going to put it behind like this so it hangs down. And I'm going to, with my hand needle, I'm going to attach that also. Now, I just do a little stitch when I'm done in the back, and then I put the needle through my loop to create a little knot. You might want to do that twice just so that it's secure. Okay, and then cut your strings. Okay, so now you have a little detail here. I'm going to tie this to my strap. So if you want, you could cut out tons of flowers and you could stitch them all over your bag, or you could cut out butterflies or stars, or you could cover the whole strap with stars. So now that you have the bag sewn, the decorating is all up to you. That concludes our making a tote bag from a broken umbrella tutorial, and make sure you check back at Kiki often to see if there's any other awesome projects to make. Good luck with your bag.
Send images of your umbrella tote to submissions@kikimag.com. The end.